I start first with the GDP issue. What effect do you think the revised GDP figures will have on our borrowing costs, if any? Have you given any thought to that?
I suppose a couple of impacts. First of all, just the market impact of the surprise of the statistics. I've already said at the time that we fielded a lot of calls from investors, post the number, and so there's a lot of explaining to do, and if you're explaining, you're losing really to some extent. So I think GDP as a statistics, and therefore the debt to GDP ratio and other ratios that we use that include GDP are less valuable today than they were a couple of weeks ago, because they have been, if you like, distorted and are more difficult to explain. So investors that we've been speaking to are already just moving on to look at other indicators of our economic health, the ability to repay, rather than that traditional ratio of debt to GDP. So I think it's less valuable as a tool than it was, and I think whether we economists come up, or the CSO come up with some new series that is GDP X the distortions, and maybe we can go back to having some confidence in that. But for the moment, investors are looking at other indicators in terms of looking at the economy.
Well, many people would see it as a bit more than a lot of explaining has to be done. There's disbelief internationally from a lot of economists. A lot of the international reporting of the growth figures was that they were more than just distorted, that they don't form the basis upon which decisions can be made. And we know that the GDP figures have an impact on the implication of the fiscal rules and debt to GDP ratios and all of that. But in terms of borrowing, obviously fund and asset managers, and they hold 50% of government debt, have to have confidence in the figures. And it's interesting that the language that you use is very similar to the language that the CSO Director General, Pádraig Dalton, used at the McGill Summer School, where he said that GDP and GNP, although required internationally, no longer provide a sufficient understanding of the domestic economy. But that's only because the figures are, we can say, distorted, or the figures are not real, and we're not being presented with what are the real figures. Surely that has to be a real concern, because as we know, GDP and GNP are the figures that are used internationally. They are the figures that investors look at. So what I'm hearing from you is you're accepting that fund managers and asset managers are concerned, have been in contact with your office, are expressing their concerns about these figures, and surely that's something that needs to be addressed.
Well, insofar as it needs to be addressed, we are addressing it by engaging conversations with them and trying to clarify their questions. But I think to a large extent I don't disagree with what you're saying, Deputy, in relation to those figures, GDP, GNP, have been distorted and are less useful. There's no doubt about it. But if you look at our investor pack that we take out on the road, to which we're constantly on the road with, and it's available on our website, updated every month, it probably has 40 different economic indicators in there, of which the debt to GDP is one, and maybe GDP makes up 3 or 4 of them. So investors always look at, and these are big decisions that investment managers have made. They're looking right under the hood, under the bonnet. They're getting in there and taking a look around. They're looking at 20, 30 indicators to make sure that things are what they seem, and those indicators. So, and it's the combination of indicators that will give you the overall picture.
But you also have to explain, and you said that you've had calls from investors, so you've had to explain the GDP figures, and you used the word distortion yourself. So when you use the word distortion, what do you mean by it? In terms of the distortion of the GDP or GNP figures, what's your understanding of what the distortion is?
What I mean by that is that the debt to GDP ratio, as traditionally used, the reason that it's used as by bond investors in particular, is that as your debt to GDP ratio falls or improves, the assumption is that your ability to pay your debts and refinance your debts is improving simultaneous with that, and that's why it's used as a good indicator. In the case where an element of the GDP growth has no economic value on the other side, therefore your ability to repay and finance your debts are no more improved than they were before the number, then it's less valuable as a tool for investors to use, because it's not necessarily because of that distortion. In this case, it's been told to us by the CSO that it's not necessarily matched with actual economic activity, and therefore your ability to repay and refinance isn't matched in the way that it ordinarily would be in the case of the GDP growth in the past.
And do you then have any role in terms of reporting back to government departments, the CSO itself? So you're on the front line in terms of, from the borrowing side, asset managers, fund managers, you've got these requests in, you've had to explain, you've done all of that, you have your own view of what the issues are. So I'm assuming then that you have also some responsibility to report that back, and you might just talk us through what then that involves, or is there any reporting back from your perspective?
Well, we have a very close relationship with the Department of Finance, and we would give feedback, always on any material issues straight through. We've got a very close working relationship. Secretary General is on the board of the NTMA as an ex officio member, and so there's regular contact and a very good relationship. All that feedback goes back and forth. The CSO are independent, so that's a separate matter.
But do you engage with them?
No.
And do they engage with G?
No.
Would that be useful given that they calculate the figures?
That's really a matter for them.